The Prime Minister asked me to put together an expert panel, not to make recommendations, but to summarise all the evidence for the Cannabis Referendum to help people make up their mind about how to vote.
The research is really just to provide the evidence and critique the evidence and provide some analysis and just be a trusted source that people can rely on in terms of deciding on this quite complicated issue. But even with that evidence in front of people, I mean, inevitably they bring in their own value judgments about cannabis and other psychoactive drugs, and that really makes their decision. So the role of the panel was really to identify a consensus based on the evidence, to provide to people in a really easily digestible way, so it would help them or assist them make their decision in the referendum.
There's two pieces of cannabis legislation that people are most familiar with, and often they get confused. The first piece of legislation is the Medicinal Cannabis Act. Now that's already been enacted, and that enables patients to get prescriptions of cannabis-based products from their doctors for specific medical purposes. At the end of this year there's going to be an election, and during the election there'll be a referendum about the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use. So the first piece of legislation is about medicine and medical conditions and prescription, and the second piece of legislation is about recreational use of marijuana for any purpose whatsoever.
The thing for the public to know is that cannabis is a drug that people use to alter their mental state. Like alcohol and like any psychoactive drug. Lots of people like using cannabis to alter their mental states, and they perceive for them it does them some good, whatever it might be. Cannabis is widely used in New Zealand, and so I applaud the government for tackling this problem. The kind of do-nothing approach that we've had for a long time really hasn't served New Zealand well. Having said that, how you approach this is going to be a bit of a minefield, and people are going to have a wide variety of options.
We understand a little bit about how the drug works, but not as much as we would if it was legal. So research on the drug hasn't been as extensive as you might like if you're looking through the evidence base. And of course, how the drug works isn't really the important thing. The important thing is the harm it might do, and whether that harm increases or decreases if you put it in a legalised framework.
In New Zealand, we're lucky we have two of the best longitudinal studies in the world. They're general cohort studies, so they talk to the whole of the population as opposed to talking to a specific little bit of it. One of those is in Christchurch and one of those is in Dunedin.
The study itself follows a group of over 1,000 people who were born in Christchurch in the middle of 1977, so between April and August of that year. And 97% of the babies born during that period in Christchurch were entered into the study. And we followed them throughout their lives. In our last assessment, we saw them 3 years ago when they were 40 years old. One of the most striking things to me about examination of substance use in our cohort is just how common it is. So, for example, 80% of our cohort members had reported that they've used cannabis on at least one occasion by age 35, which tells you just how widespread cannabis use is in New Zealand.
Those studies essentially make clear that there is a link between early cannabis exposure and later psychotic mental illness. And so that's kind of important, particularly if you develop schizophrenia. That's problematic, as it's for some people a chronic and enduring, severely dysfunctional mental illness. Not for everyone. So many people manage to make a reasonable recovery from a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but for some. The other thing that longitudinal study really clearly shows us is lots of people who have been exposed to cannabis early in life don't go on to develop psychotic mental illness. So early exposure doesn't guarantee you a diagnosis of schizophrenia later in life, but it does increase your risk.
A small group of people that tend to suffer more harm are disproportionately young, Māori and male. And so I think the harms fit into two categories. One is the medical harm, if you will. People worry about dependence, some psychotic symptoms, slim evidence about whether it can be associated with depression. But more importantly, perhaps, in terms of making the decision, is the social harm. So we can try and guard against the number of people that overuse cannabis in a legal framework. Currently, in a prohibition framework, the people that suffer harm from having criminal charges are disproportionately young Māori men. And so it's not about people being locked up, it's about people being excluded from school or put on a path that cascades into more and more social harm. So in the panel, we're not just looking at the medical effects, we're also looking at the social effects and how the legal framework might alter those and minimise harm across the board.
There's reasonably good evidence to suggest that if you smoke cannabis during pregnancy, you're more likely to have a lighter baby, so a lower birth weight baby. And there's a whole separate huge body of knowledge that tells us low birth weight is directly correlated to multiple psychosocial adversity later in life.
Cannabis can come in, I guess, 3 different forms. So the traditional cannabis plant as edibles and basically food, or as concentrates where you take the oils out of cannabis. A lot of the harm is related to the potency and the delivery form. The problem with edibles and concentrates, particularly concentrates, is they can be very high THC, and essentially just like alcohol, the higher the potency, the more likely that you're going to produce harm. So in cannabis cases, it's more likely that you experience things like dependency and psychosis. So very high THC cannabis is more likely to produce those effects. With edibles, the other risk is that because you're ingesting it, it takes longer for the effects to take effect. So that can result in problems where people are consuming it, they don't feel the effect, and so they keep taking more before the effects kick in. The other thing is smoking. Obviously, smoking anything is bad for your respiratory system and for your lungs. So there's forms that you can take, so vaping or the edibles that avoid that kind of risk.
The panel agrees pretty much on the degree of harm that cannabis does at the moment. It's not, generally speaking, as harmful as alcohol and tobacco, although the data is a bit scarce because it's not a legal drug at the moment, so it's hard to really see what it's doing. A small group of people, if they take cannabis often and they take a really potent form of it and they take it when they're young, will suffer some harms, and a lot of people won't suffer any harm at all. So there's one particular group that is vulnerable, and of course they're vulnerable at the moment, and the question is, can we reduce the size of that group and the amount of harm if it's legal versus at the moment where it's not legal.
Cannabis has got a very interesting chemistry. The major compounds of interest are called cannabinoids, and the 2 major cannabinoids are 4-hydroxycannabinol, known as THC, and CBD, or cannabidiol. And the THC is the major psychoactive compound, whereas CBD is associated with more of the medical benefit effects.
I think if cannabis were to be legalised, it would be important to regulate the amount of THC, the most psychoactive substance in cannabis. It would be important to regulate how much was in each of those legalised products.
Consistency of products is very, very important, and consistency starts right back with the plant and the genetics of the plant. We want consistency of the ratio of the different active compounds in cannabis, and so the way to guarantee that would be to understand the genetics of the plant and make sure that the production of the plant is consistent, and also the manufacture of the product, the end products, is also done in a way that is consistent and producing a consistent ratio of the different cannabinoids. And to test that, there would be chemical tests done on the plants all the way through from beginning to end.
Overseas experience gives us some clues as to what might happen if we legalise here. But of course, everybody's used a slightly different legal framework, and this has happened quite recently, so the evidence base is quite short. But we can see that in some places where the state has taken control of the market, there's early evidence that harm might be reduced in some areas and maybe slightly increased in others.
Overseas, where recreational marijuana use is legalised, the quality of the product is highly regulated, and there needs to be some level of assurance around not only the chemistry but also the pesticide levels on the plants and the microbial content of the material as well that's used for these products.
Recently I was in Vancouver. Obviously I had an interest in this area. I went to a legal cannabis store and had a look around. All of the products they had there followed good manufacturing process, so were free of heavy metals, were free of pesticides, were free of fungi and moulds, all of which can harm people. And the proportions of THC to CBD in all of the products that were there were very clearly marked and labelled, and producers are audited to ensure that their products are what they say they are. And so at least we have some surety about what you're taking.
In terms of what we're learning overseas from regulated markets, what we can tell from that data is it doesn't necessarily lead to it doesn't lead to an increase in youth use of cannabis. In some of those markets it's remained about the same. Looking over to Canada for how things have happened there, we've seen a reduction in youth use afterwards.
It was a law change in August of 2019, which in practice decriminalized the possession of all drugs up to a certain amount, subject to police discretion. So in other words, if police want to make a prosecution for drug possession, they are meant to present a case that that prosecution is in the public good. The result looks like there are fewer convictions, particularly for cannabis, but the early data were showing that Māori were still much more likely to be arrested for cannabis offences.
Decriminalisation, legalisation of cannabis are important issues because there's a tendency for many people, in fact probably the majority of people, to think that when you're talking about decriminalisation or you're talking about legalisation, you're actually talking about the same thing. So with decriminalisation, the cannabis would remain illegal, and what changes is the nature of the enforcement. With legalisation, the substance itself becomes legal, and it does mean that it allows a far greater level of regulation in terms of the production, supply and distribution.
The current cannabis law is really simple. There's only one law and it says you can't use it, you can't smoke it, you can't grow it, you can't sell it. So a prohibitive based regime is really simple. It's one piece of law that says you can't do those things. Does it work? No, it doesn't. We know it doesn't work because we have a lot of data that tells us that most New Zealanders will try cannabis. So notwithstanding that it's been unlawful for over 50 years, they've tried it. Some people regularly, so it doesn't work in terms of being a straight don't do that type of law.
If we think about who is being penalised, who is coming under the sanctions, when are drug laws being enforced, and of course the other side of that, when is that not happening, does seem to suggest that some communities are far more targeted than other communities. It also seems to have a generational element, so if we look between 17 and 25, we can see over half of drug convictions sit within that age range. So what does that tell us about the enforcement? And then if we look at it in regards to the enforcement against particular groups, we see that Māori are overrepresented within that group.
So obviously the law aims to punish people who break the law. So you get the punishment, whatever that might be, a fine, but you'll particularly get the stigma of conviction. So you have that against your name. But the other consequences of conviction will often be things like exclusion or stand down from school. And I think that it's important to note that boards of trustees in New Zealand are still excluding young people for cannabis use. They often don't exclude for tobacco use or alcohol use. So I think the fact that cannabis is illegal means that boards hold on to that fact and treat those young people differently. Whereas if it's tobacco or if it's alcohol, they might see that this person has a health problem. They don't take the same approach in relation to cannabis. Other life path consequences that result from a conviction for cannabis use can include obviously employment. It's difficult to get employment. It's difficult to keep employment if you are found have a cannabis conviction. You have to disclose these things in relation to travel, of course. So these things have lifelong consequences, and as it stands we have a very unequal way of policing cannabis use, and with the outcomes that are, are similarly unequal.
There are also real concerns whether having such a punitive response means that even those who seek support, who have recognised, or others have recognised, that their substance use is problematic, that the ability for them to have confidence in seeking that support, because they may be concerned around what the punitive response may be. And remember, these are coming from communities where the punitive response is far more embedded as a part of everyday experience. So for many people who use cannabis, particularly say middle class Pākehā New Zealanders, for them, the point of should we even change legislation, it's fine as it is. I can understand that point of view because largely there is no impact on both their use and on their lives. But for the groups that I look at, that is quite a significant impact.
In my role as National Youth Addiction Services Advisor, I would speak with a lot of parents across the country around what they can do with that to support their young people. And it really stood out to me that most of these parents knew that substances was around. They would hope that their children wouldn't use them, but they would also be really realistic, saying that if they do choose to use it, they hope that they would do so in the safest way possible. What I found really interesting was that while it was still challenging, it was a lot easier for parents to have their conversation with their children around alcohol, because it was legal and it was a lot more acceptable to speak about. Cannabis got grouped in the other drug side of things, and the message that usually parents say that they would give their kids was, don't touch drugs, don't do that, but they could have the conversation around how to be safe around alcohol. That's a little bit of an issue if we know that the majority of New Zealand at some point in their life has tried cannabis. So this conversation that could be happening isn't happening at the moment.
And I think people have to realise that if you've got a prohibition, you have to think even where your middle class people, where are they getting their drugs from? Where are they buying them from? And so what I've noted in my own research and with working with wahine Māori, and particularly young wahine Māori in prison, is that it often puts young people in dangerous places, and very often puts young women in dangerous places. Sometimes it puts them in dangerous places in terms of where they're actually purchasing, but more often in the groups that I'm working with, it puts them in dangerous places where particular forms of control can be put on them to put them into positions that are dangerous for them, and actually completely immerse them within a distribution network.
It's obviously with something that's completely unregulated. If people are buying things on the black market, you don't really know what people are taking. So it could be really strong, it could not be very strong at all, it could be mixed up with synthetic compounds that do harm. One of the advantages put forward for legalising it is that you do start to understand what people are taking. So in the same way as you know how strong a glass of wine is, you would know how strong a cannabis product was within a legal framework, which you don't at the moment.
But certainly in New Zealand we have a liberal approach to alcohol, which is the, psychoactive drug as a community we've legalised. And so it's not surprising that most New Zealanders think if we legalise cannabis, it'll go down the alcohol road. But it certainly doesn't have to. And in lots of jurisdictions overseas, they've taken quite different approaches to the use of cannabis not being a crime. And so it doesn't have to be a very liberal, open slather approach from a legislative perspective.
I think there's a knee-jerk reaction that says, well, if we know it does harm, why would you legalise it? And in some ways, legalising it suggests that it's condoned by society, and some people don't like that. And the other big fear that some people have is that big industry will take over. So in the same way that big tobacco and big alcohol have done harm, if we were to get the regulations wrong and allow the free market to take over, then we may end up increasing the number of people who are using cannabis just because it becomes more attractive in a legalised framework. So the argument really hinges around how we regulate.
My experience suggests that the harms of an illegal trade and the way that it enmeshes very broad ranges of people of them are really significant. that because that there is a high level of profit to be made within by organised and in fact what I often call disorganised crime as well, it means it puts people in very dangerous places. It means that the regulatory control is one of violence. So if you've got state regulation, the way you regulate that is going to be very different from where you've got regulated through gang networks, for example, where the form of regulation in that network is violence.
One of the big concerns that we all held was what would be the impact of commercialisation of cannabis and the role of industry might play. And one of the things we all really wanted to avoid was an alcohol-style market. And that's because obviously that has a really high harm market where prices are low and there's advertising. So it was clear to us that that kind of market was not what we should be doing. Middle ground approaches can include things like not-for-profits and for-benefit companies that aren't focused on expanding the market and profit. And so there's going to need to be quite a lot of work to achieve that, because whenever you've got commercial enterprises, they're obviously focused on increasing sales and profit, and also they generally oppose regulation that affects their bottom line. So that's going to be an ongoing kind of battle. So starting off in a conservative market is quite important, and looking at for-benefit and not-for-profit options.
From a legal perspective, one of the things that I think we need to really get across to voters is the fact that under a legalisation regime, there is going to be much more law than less. Under a prohibition regime, which is what we currently have, there's just one law. It says don't do that thing, don't grow it, don't share it. You'll note that the bill that we're faced with is called the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill. Under a prohibition regime, you don't need to control the thing because you're not allowed it. If it's legal, we need to have all sorts of regulation, not only in relation to the criminal justice aspect, but into the economic impact and how do we control this thing. So there'll be a licensing authority, there will be licenses, the types of people will have thresholds and criteria as to who is allowed to hold a license. In a control regime, as there have been in all of the other jurisdictions where cannabis has been legalised around the world, you need to have rules and laws around who can smoke it, who can use it, not only who can smoke it, but what sort of preparations are we talking about? Are we talking about edibles? Are we talking about oils? Are we talking about the organic plant? So there has to be rules around that, around the strength of the product, around age controls and limits. Currently there is no limit. We almost have a blinkered approach to saying if it's illegal then we don't care, because no one's allowed to do it, when the reality is that most people do.
I think one of the things people really can do when they work their way through this issue is to think about the criteria that they think is most important in this debate. So an obvious one is health, and health and social harm from cannabis use, but there are other important ones that people raise, so things like reducing criminalisation and arrest of minorities like Maori, and changing the criminal justice approach to drug use. There's also political reasons in terms of the right to use versus paternalism, and there's also really strong economic arguments in terms of taxation and jobs and business. But on the other hand, there's also a whole lot of things about controlling use and basically reducing intoxication in the community and protecting younger people's access to cannabis. So starting out by understanding what criteria are important to you is one way of kind of navigating your way through this issue, and then looking at those issues individually and how well legalisation versus other regimes work.